Jake Martinez pressed his face against the small window of the transport ship as Meridian Academy came into view. The massive space station hung in the darkness like a silver jewel, its lights twinkling against the black void. He had dreamed of this moment for 3 years, ever since Earth had finally been accepted into the Galactic Education Alliance. The ship docked with a soft thud that barely registered through the hull. Jake gathered his single bag and followed the other passengers toward the exit. Most of them towered over him, their alien forms moving with grace he could never match. The Xanthari looked like walking mountains of muscle and bone, their skin tough as armor. The Vex sparkled like living crystals, their bodies catching and reflecting light in ways that hurt to look at directly. The Lumina floated rather than walked, their energy forms shifting between colors Jake had no names for. Nobody spoke to him during the journey. Nobody even looked at him. The Academy's docking bay was enormous, filled with ships from a dozen different worlds. Jake stood in the middle of it all, suddenly feeling very small and very alone. A floating screen approached him, its surface glowing with soft blue light. Jake Martinez, human, Earth origin, the screen announced in a voice that sounded like music. Dormitory assignment, Level 7, Section C, Room 847. Your roommate is Crystal Song of Dawn, Vex origin. Welcome to Meridian Academy. Jake thanked the screen, though he wasn't sure if it could hear him. He picked up his bag and started, walking toward the dormitory levels, following the signs that appeared in the air as he moved. The academy was bigger than any building he had ever seen on Earth. The corridors stretched for what seemed like miles, with ceilings so high they disappeared into shadows. Students moved past him in groups, talking in languages that sounded like singing or growling, or the whisper of wind through leaves. None of them paid attention to the small human walking alone with his single bag. Jake had expected this, but it still hurt more than he thought it would. Room 847 was halfway down a corridor that seemed to go on forever. Jake pressed his hand against the door panel and it slid open with a soft hiss. The room was divided into 2 sections, each designed for different types of beings. One side had a bed, desk, and storage units sized for humans. The other side looked like the inside of a crystal cave, with faceted surfaces that caught and split light into rainbow patterns. His roommate was already there, sitting at what Jake assumed was a desk, though it looked more like a sculpture made of living light. Crystal Song of Dawn was beautiful in a way that made Jake's eyes water. The Vex's body was made of what looked like clear crystal, but it moved like liquid, shifting and flowing as thoughts passed through it. "You must be the human," Crystal Song of Dawn said without looking up from whatever he was working on. His voice sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "I have heard much about your species, mostly that you are very young and very loud." Jake set his bag down on his bed. "I'm Jake. Nice to meet you. I am Crystal Song of Dawn, though I suppose your vocal cords cannot properly pronounce my true name. You may call me Crystal if you must address me directly, though I prefer to work in silence." Jake nodded and began unpacking his few belongings. He had brought books, mostly history and military strategy, subjects that had always fascinated him. Crystal glanced over when Jake set them on his desk. "Curious," Crystal said. "Most species study such things as historical curiosities. Why do humans still find war interesting?" "Maybe because we're still pretty good at it," Jake replied, then immediately regretted the words. They sounded boastful and stupid. Crystal made a sound like breaking glass, which Jake realized was probably laughter. "Yes, I have heard this about humans. You fight among yourselves even now, do you not? How fascinating that a species so primitive was granted academy admission." Jake felt his face burn with embarrassment, but he didn't respond. He finished unpacking in silence while Crystal returned to his work. When he was done, Jake left the room to explore the academy. The corridors were full of students heading to their first classes. Jake followed the crowd, trying not to stare at the incredible variety of life forms around him. There were beings made of what looked like living metal, others that seemed to be made of pure energy, and some that defied description entirely. They all moved with purpose, talking to friends, laughing at jokes he couldn't understand, living lives that seemed so much more interesting than his own. Jake found the dining hall by following his nose. The smell of food from a dozen worlds mixed together into something that was both wonderful and overwhelming. He got in line behind a group of Zenthari students, their massive forms blocking his view of the food options ahead. "Excuse me," Jake said to the nearest Zenthari, a female with intricate tattoos covering her arms. "Could you tell me what the blue stuff is?" The Zenthari looked down at him, her expression unreadable. "Human food is in the far corner," she said in a voice like gravel. "You should not eat our food, it would probably kill you." She turned away before Jake could respond, dismissing him as completely as if he had never spoken. Jake stood there, for a moment feeling foolish, then made his way to the corner she had indicated. There was indeed a small section labeled Human-Compatible Foods, with selections that looked depressingly familiar. Jake took his tray to an empty table and sat alone, watching the other students. They seemed so confident, so sure of their place in the galaxy. The Zenthari talked about honor and glory, their voices carrying across the room. The Vex discussed mathematical concepts that Jake could barely comprehend. The Lumina communicated through light patterns that looked like living art. Nobody looked at the human sitting by himself in the corner. After dinner, Jake attended his first class, Galactic History taught by Dr. Kethvar, a Zenthari professor whose reputation was legendary throughout the academy. The classroom was huge, with seating designed for dozens of different body types. Jake found a human-sized seat in the back row. Dr. Kethvar was an impressive figure, even by Zenthari standards. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, with scars covering his arms and face that spoke of battles fought long ago. His voice filled the room without effort. "Today we discuss the rise of civilization in the galaxy," Dr. Kethvar began. "For the past 10,000 years, the great species have worked together to build a peaceful society based on cooperation and mutual respect. We have eliminated war, hunger, and suffering from our worlds." Jake raised his hand. Dr. Kethvar's eyes found him in the back row, and Jake saw something like disappointment cross the professor's features. "Yes, human? What about the hegemony wars 3,000 years ago? Or the Vex-Lumina conflict that ended only 500 years ago? Those were pretty major wars." The classroom fell silent. Jake could feel dozens of alien eyes turning to stare at him. Dr. Kethvar's expression hardened. "Those were conflicts between civilized species seeking diplomatic solutions," the professor said coldly. "They bear no resemblance to the barbaric practices of primitive worlds. Perhaps you should focus on understanding our current peaceful society, rather than dwelling on ancient violence." Jake felt his face burn again, but this time with anger rather than embarrassment. "I just thought that understanding how conflicts were resolved might help us avoid future ones. Humans," Dr. Kethvar said with a dismissive wave of his hand, "always assume that violence is the answer to every problem. This is why your species was the last to be admitted to galactic society. I suggest you spend less time studying war and more time learning how civilized beings solve their differences." The other students murmured agreement, and Jake sank lower in his seat. He didn't speak for the rest of the class, even when Dr. Kethvar made statements about galactic history that Jake knew were incomplete or wrong. Walking back to his dormitory after classes, Jake felt more alone than ever. The academy's corridors seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him, filled with beings who saw him as a curiosity at best, a primitive embarrassment at worst. He had come here hoping to learn from the galaxy's greatest minds, but instead found himself treated like a child who had wandered into an adult conversation. Back in his room, Crystal Song of Dawn was working at his desk again, patterns of light dancing through his crystal body as he processed information at speeds Jake couldn't imagine. "How were your classes?" Crystal asked without looking up. "Fine," Jake lied. "I heard about your exchange with Dr. Kethvar. News travels quickly here." Jake sat heavily on his bed. "I just asked a question." "You questioned the professor's expertise in front of the entire class. That was either very brave or very stupid." "Probably stupid." Crystal finally turned toward him, light patterns shifting in what Jake was beginning to recognize as amusement. "Perhaps, but also interesting. Most species learn not to question authority. Humans seem to have trouble with that concept. Is that supposed to be a compliment?" "I am not sure yet," Crystal replied. But I find it curious that a species as young as yours would develop such confidence. Most beings your age are still learning to walk properly. Jake didn't know how to respond to that, so he didn't. He pulled out one of his books and began reading about the frontier wars, conflicts that had shaped human expansion into space. The strategies and tactics felt familiar in a way that the Academy's advanced mathematics and theoretical physics. Jake had been at Meridian Academy for 3 weeks when the alarm started screaming. He was in the library, reading about the old Earth wars that nobody else seemed to care about, when the lights suddenly turned red and a sound like breaking metal filled the air. The other students looked around in confusion. Most of them had never heard an emergency alarm before. Their worlds had been peaceful for so long that danger was just something they read about in history books. Jake knew that sound. Every human child learned what emergency alarms meant. He dropped his book and ran toward the nearest window that looked out into space. What he saw made his blood turn cold. Ships were coming toward the Academy, but they weren't like any ships he had ever seen before. They were black and sleek, with no lights or markings. They moved wrong too, like they were bending space around themselves instead of flying through. And there were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, and they were coming fast. "Everyone needs to get to the emergency shelters," Jake shouted to the other students in the library. They stared at him like he was crazy. A vexed student named Harmony of Numbers laughed, the sound like breaking crystal. "Relax, human. The Academy's shields are the strongest in the galaxy. Nothing can get through them." As if the universe wanted to prove her wrong, the first enemy ship passed through the shields like they weren't even there. Then another. Then 10 more. The peaceful students stopped laughing. Jake ran toward the dormitories. He had to find Crystal Song of Dawn and get to safety. The corridors were starting to fill with confused students and teachers, most of them walking slowly and talking in calm voices. They still didn't understand what was happening. The first explosion shook the entire academy. The lights flickered and the artificial gravity stuttered for a moment. Jake grabbed the wall to keep from falling while alien students around him cried out in fear. Some of the lumina began flashing bright colors, which Jake realized was probably their version of screaming. By the time Jake reached his dormitory level, the attacks were getting worse. He could hear the sound of metal being torn apart somewhere above him. Emergency announcements were playing in 12 different languages, but they all said the same thing. Unknown hostile forces had breached the Academy's defenses, and all students should shelter in place. Jake burst into his room to find Crystal Song of Dawn, huddled in the corner, his crystal body flickering with frightened patterns of light. "What is happening?" Crystal asked. "The professors said this was impossible. The Academy is supposed to be safe." "Safe doesn't mean much when someone wants you dead badly enough," Jake said, grabbing his emergency kit from under his bed. Every human was taught to keep emergency supplies ready. It was another one of those primitive habits that the other species thought was silly. Another explosion, closer this time. The floor shook and some of Crystal's belongings fell from his desk. Through the walls, Jake could hear other students crying and calling for help. None of them knew what to do because nothing like this had ever happened to them before. Jake opened his emergency kit and started pulling out supplies. Water purification tablets, medical supplies, a small plasma torch, emergency rations. Crystal watched him with amazement. "You came prepared for war," Crystal said. "I came prepared for emergencies," Jake corrected. "On Earth, we learn that bad things can happen anywhere, anytime." The lights went out. Emergency power kicked in a few seconds later, bathing everything in red light that made the room look like the inside of a beating heart. In the distance, Jake could hear something that made his stomach clench with fear, the sound of weapons fire in the corridors. "We need to move," Jake said. "This room is a trap if they get past the blast doors." "Who is they?" Crystal asked. Jake peered out into the corridor through the small window in their door. What he saw made him step back quickly. Machines were moving through the hallway, but they weren't like any robots he had ever seen. They looked like metal spiders the size of large dogs with cutting tools instead of legs and sensors that glowed red in the darkness. Behind them came larger machines that walked on 2 legs like metal men, carrying weapons that hummed with deadly energy. One of the smaller machines stopped at a door 3 rooms down from Jake's. It extended a cutting tool and began slicing through the metal like it was paper. Jake could hear students screaming inside. "We have to help them," Crystal said, starting toward the door. Jake grabbed his roommate's arm, surprised at how solid the crystal body felt. "No, we can't fight those things with our bare hands. We need to be smart about this." "Smart? Those are our friends dying, and we'll be dead too if we run out there without a plan." Jake forced himself to think clearly while the sounds of destruction grew closer. His mind went back to all those military history books that everyone had mocked him for reading. What would a good commander do in this situation? First, gather intelligence. Second, secure your position. Third, find other survivors. Fourth, fight back with whatever you have. "Crystal, can you communicate with the Academy's computer system? From here?" "Yes, but what good will that do? I need to know where these things are coming from and how many students are still alive." Crystal Song of Dawn placed his hands against the wall, and his body began glowing brighter. Lines of light ran from his fingers into the Academy's data networks. After a moment, his glow dimmed and he looked sick. "There are 17 breach points throughout the Academy," Crystal said, his voice shaking. "The attackers call themselves Devourers. They're machines that consume organic life to power themselves. Student casualties are already over 40%. Jake felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. 40%. That meant hundreds of students were already dead, including many he had shared classes with just hours earlier. "Where are the largest groups of survivors?" "Central Hub Level 5, about 60 students and teachers barricaded in the main auditorium. But the Devourers are moving toward them." Jake looked around their room, his mind racing. They had a plasma torch, some basic tools, and cleaning chemicals. Not much to fight with, but maybe enough if he was creative. "Crystal, I need you to do something for me. Contact that group in the auditorium and tell them to seal the air vents. These machines probably use the ventilation system to move around." "How do you know that?" "Because that's what I would do." While Crystal sent the message, Jake began taking apart the cleaning supplies. Humans had learned long ago that almost anything could be turned into a weapon if you were desperate enough. The Academy's cleaning chemicals weren't meant to be mixed together, but that made them perfect for what Jake had in mind. The cutting sound was getting closer. The machines had finished with the room down the hall and were moving to the next one. Jake could hear more screaming, then sudden silence. "Jake," Crystal whispered, "they're almost here." "I know. Help me move this furniture." They barricaded the door with Crystal's desk and Jake's bed, though both of them knew it wouldn't stop the machines for long. Jake finished mixing his improvised explosives and set them near the entrance. "When they break through, you get behind that wall panel. And don't come out until I tell you," Jake said. "What about you?" "I'm going to show these things why humans study war." The cutting sound reached their door. Sparks began flying as metal teeth bit into the reinforced barrier. Jake could see the red glow of sensors through the growing hole. His heart was beating so fast he thought it might explode, but his hands were steady. The first spider machine poked its sensors through the breach. Jake triggered his explosive device. The blast was smaller than he had hoped, but loud enough to deafen him temporarily. The machine stumbled backward, damaged but not destroyed. 2 more pushed through the hole, their cutting tools extended and ready to slice apart anything that moved. Jake grabbed the plasma torch and rolled to the side as energy beams scorched the wall where he had been standing. The torch wasn't designed as a weapon, but it cut through metal when he jammed it into the first machine's sensor cluster. Sparks flew and the machine collapsed, twitching. The second machine was faster. Its cutting arm swept toward Jake's head, missing by inches. Jake ducked and came up with a metal bar he had torn from Crystal's destroyed desk. He swung it as hard as he could at the machine's joint connections. Metal screamed against metal. The machine's arm hung at a wrong angle, but it kept coming. Jake hit it again and again until finally something important broke inside it, and it stopped moving. The third machine was the size of a person, with weapons that could cut through. The Academy's hull. Jake looked at it and realized he was probably going to die in the next few seconds, but at least he would die fighting, which was more than most of the galaxy seemed capable of. The machine raised its weapon. Jake threw himself forward, inside its reach, and jammed the plasma torch into what he hoped was its power core. The explosion threw him across the room and into the wall. Everything went white, then black, then white again. When his vision cleared, he was lying on the floor covered in metal debris. The machine was scattered in pieces around the room. Crystal's Song of Dawn emerged from his hiding place, staring at Jake with something that might have been awe. "You destroyed them," Crystal said. "All of them." Jake sat up slowly, checking for broken bones. Everything hurt, but he seemed to be in one piece. "Yeah, well, turns out all that pry." Jake and Crystal Song of Dawn moved through the Academy's damaged corridors like ghosts. The red emergency lighting cast strange shadows on the walls, and the smell of burned metal filled the air. Bodies of students and machines lay scattered throughout the hallways, silent witnesses to the violence that had torn through their peaceful world. Crystal stayed close behind Jake, his crystal body dim with fear. Every few steps Jake would stop and listen, trying to figure out where the Devourers were moving. The sounds of battle echoed from different parts of the Academy, but Jake could tell they were losing. The screams were getting fewer, and the mechanical sounds were getting louder. "How much further to the auditorium?" Jake whispered. "2 more levels down," Crystal replied. "But Jake, there are at least 20 Devourer units between us and them. We cannot fight that many. We don't fight them all at once, we fight them smart." Jake led them to a maintenance shaft he had noticed during his first week at the Academy. Most students ignored the service areas, but Jake had explored them out of boredom. Now that curiosity might save their lives. The shaft was barely wide, enough for Jake to crawl through, and Crystal had to compress his body into a smaller form to fit. They moved through the darkness, following the faint sounds of combat below them. Jake counted ventilation grates as they passed, building a mental map of the Academy's layout. When they reached the level above the auditorium, Jake could hear voices through the metal. Human voices, Zenthari voices, even some Vex speaking in their musical language. The survivors were still alive, but he could also hear the sound of cutting tools working on the auditorium doors. Jake found a maintenance panel and carefully opened it. Below them was a storage room filled with cleaning supplies and repair equipment. More importantly, it was right next to the auditorium, and the Devourers hadn't found it yet. They dropped down into the storage room as quietly as possible. Jake immediately started looking through the supplies, his mind working on a plan. Crystal watched him nervously. "What are you doing?" "Building weapons," Jake said, pulling pipes and chemical containers off the shelves. "These cleaning acids will eat through Devourer armor if we can get them hot enough. These pipes can be turned into projectile launchers, and this electrical equipment can be overloaded to create electromagnetic pulses." "You learned all this from your war books?" "I learned it from being human. My species has been turning everyday things into weapons for thousands of years." Jake worked quickly, his hands steady despite the sounds of destruction outside. He built 3 pipe bombs using cleaning chemicals and electronic timers. He jury-rigged a spray system that could shoot acid in a wide pattern. He even managed to create a simple electromagnetic pulse device using the room's power systems. While Jake worked, Crystal connected to the Academy's communication network and contacted the survivors in the auditorium. "There are 53 beings still alive in there," Crystal reported. 32 students and 21 faculty members. They have been trying to contact their homeworlds for help, but the Devourers are jamming all communications. "What about weapons?" "Dr. Kethavar has a ceremonial plasma sword, but it is only designed for display. A few Zenthari students have training weapons, but nothing meant for real combat. The Vex students are trying to calculate a mathematical solution to their problem, and the Lumina are attempting to communicate with the attackers." Jake shook his head. Even facing death, the other species were trying to solve the problem using their traditional methods. The Zenthari wanted to fight with honor, the Vex wanted to think their way out, and the Lumina wanted to talk. None of them understood that the Devourers were machines designed for one purpose: consuming organic life. "Tell them to stop trying to communicate with the Devourers," Jake said. "Machines like this don't negotiate. They just kill and consume. The survivors need to prepare for a fight. They want to know what your plan is." Jake looked at his improvised weapons. They weren't much, but they might be enough to surprise the Devourers. Surprise was the only advantage humans had ever had against stronger enemies. Tell them that in 60 seconds I'm going to create a distraction. When the Devourers move to investigate, they need to attack from behind. No honor, no fair fighting, no rules. Just hit them as hard as they can with whatever they have. Crystal relayed the message, then looked at Jake with concern. They are asking if you have military training. No, but every human child plays war games. We pretend to fight from the time we can walk. Other species play games about cooperation and learning. Humans play games about winning. Jake picked up his weapons and moved toward the door. Through the metal, he could hear the Devourers getting closer to breaking through the auditorium's defenses. In a few more minutes, everyone inside would be dead. Crystal, I need you to stay here and coordinate with the survivors. When I give the signal, tell them to attack. What signal? Trust me, you'll know it. Jake slipped out of the storage room and into the corridor. The auditorium entrance was 50 meters away, surrounded by Devourer machines of different sizes. Some were cutting through the doors while others stood guard. Jake could see at least 15 units, maybe more. He placed his first pipe bomb against a power junction 30 meters from the auditorium, set the timer for 30 seconds, then moved to his second position. The electromagnetic pulse device went next to a cluster of smaller Devourers. The acid sprayer he kept with him. Jake had learned about asymmetric warfare from his history books. When you were outnumbered and outgunned, you didn't fight fair. You used every dirty trick you could think of. You made the enemy come to you. You turned their strength against them. The first bomb exploded right on schedule. The lights went out in that section of corridor, and several Devourers immediately moved to investigate. Jake triggered the electromagnetic pulse device as they clustered around the damaged power junction. Sparks flew and 3 machines collapsed as their systems overloaded. The remaining Devourers turned toward Jake's position, their weapons charging with energy. This was the part of the plan that Jake wasn't sure would work. He had to make them angry enough to chase him, but not so angry that they ignored the auditorium completely. Jake stepped into the open and raised his acid sprayer. Hey, scrap metal. Looking for me? The Devourers opened fire immediately. Energy beams scorched the walls around Jake as he dove for cover behind a damaged support beam. He could hear their mechanical voices talking to each other in rapid bursts of electronic noise. They were coordinating their attack, trying to surround him. Perfect. Jake triggered his second pipe bomb, which he had hidden in the ceiling above the Devourers. The explosion brought down chunks of metal and damaged several more machines. The survivors in the auditorium must have heard his signal because suddenly, the damaged doors burst open and angry alien students poured out. Dr. Kethvar led the charge, his ceremonial plasma sword blazing with energy. The massive Zenthari professor had never looked more like a warrior as he cut through the nearest Devourer with a roar that echoed through the corridor. Behind him came Zenthari students with improvised clubs and spears, their faces set with determination Jake had never seen before. The Vex students attacked in perfect coordination, their crystal bodies reflecting and focusing light from the emergency systems into concentrated beams that overloaded Devourer sensors. The Lumina had stopped trying to communicate and started channeling their energy into destructive bursts that fried electronic systems. Even Crystal Song of Dawn had joined the fight, using his connection to the Academy's computer systems to turn the lights and artificial gravity on and off, disorienting the remaining machines. The battle was short and brutal. The Devourers had been built to fight peaceful species using traditional tactics. They weren't prepared for the coordinated chaos that 50 desperate beings could create when they stopped following rules and started fighting to survive. When the last machine fell silent, the corridor was filled with the sound of heavy breathing and nervous laughter. Alien students who had never imagined themselves capable of violence stood over the wreckage of their enemies, amazed at what they had accomplished. Dr. Kethvar approached Jake, his plasma sword still humming with energy. The Zenthari professor's armor was scorched and his face was covered with cuts, but his eyes held something Jake had never seen there before. Respect. Human, Dr. Kethvar said, his voice rough with exhaustion. I owe you an apology. I called your species primitive, but you have shown us something we had forgotten. Sometimes survival requires more than civilization. Sometimes it requires the willingness to be uncivilized. Jake looked around at the alien faces staring at him. Students who had ignored him for weeks were now waiting for his orders. Teachers who had dismissed his questions were asking for his advice. He had become the leader they needed, not because he was the strongest or the smartest, but because he understood something they had forgotten: how to fight when everything was on the line. "This isn't over," Jake said. "We won this battle, but there are more devourers in the academy. We need to find the other survivors and group up. Then we need to figure out how to stop these things permanently." "What do you need from us?" asked Harmony of Numbers, the Vex student who had laughed at Jake's warnings just hours earlier. Jake. The academy's main computer core hummed with activity 3 levels below the auditorium. Jake and his group of 53 survivors moved through the corridors like a small army, armed with weapons they had built from laboratory equipment and maintenance supplies. The peaceful school had become a battlefield and the students had become soldiers. Jake walked at the front with Dr. Kethvar and Crystal Song of Dawn. Behind them came Zenthari students carrying plasma cutters like swords, Vex students with electromagnetic pulse devices, and Lumina who had learned to focus their energy into deadly beams. They had become something their species had never been before: warriors. "The Devourers are trying to drain the Academy's main power core," Crystal explained as they moved. "If they succeed, they will have enough energy to call more ships. Hundreds. More." "How long do we have?" Jake asked. "Maybe 30 minutes before the drain is complete." Jake nodded. 30 minutes to save not just the Academy, but potentially the entire galaxy. If the Devourers got enough power to call their main fleet, no world would be safe. The peaceful species of the galaxy had no idea how to fight a war against machines that consumed everything in their path. They reached the entrance to the computer core level and found it heavily defended. Through the transparent barriers, Jake could see dozens of Devourer units surrounding the massive energy columns that powered the Academy. These machines were different from the ones they had fought before. They were bigger, more heavily armed, and they moved with purpose instead of just hunting randomly. "There are at least 40 of them," Dr. Kethavar said, gripping his plasma sword tighter. "Even with everything we have learned, we cannot fight that many in open combat." Jake studied the layout of the computer core. The energy columns created natural cover, but they also created choke points. The Devourers had positioned themselves to defend against a direct assault, which meant they were thinking tactically now instead of just following basic programming. "We don't fight them in open combat," Jake said. "We fight them like humans fight. We cheat." "What do you mean?" asked Harmony of Numbers. Jake pointed to the ventilation systems that ran throughout the core chamber. "Those air ducts connect to every part of this level. If we can get explosive devices into the right positions, we can bring down sections of the ceiling and walls. Create chaos and confusion." "That could damage the power core," Crystal warned. "If the energy containment fails, it could destroy the entire Academy. If we don't stop the Devourers, they'll destroy everything anyway," Jake replied. "Sometimes you have to risk everything to save anything." Jake divided his group into 3 teams. Dr. Kethvar would lead the Zenthari students in a direct assault to draw the Devourers' attention. The Vex and Lumina students would use the side corridors to attack the machine's flanks. Jake would take a small team through the ventilation system to plant explosives in key positions. "Remember," Jake told them before they separated, "these machines expect us to fight like civilized beings. They expect honor and rules and predictable tactics. Give them chaos instead. Fight dirty. Fight like your lives depend on it, because they do." Dr. Kethaver placed a massive hand on Jake's shoulder. "Human, if we do not survive this, I want you to know that I was wrong about your species. You have taught us something valuable about survival. We're all going to survive this," Jake said, with more confidence than he felt. "And when we do, the galaxy is going to be a very different place." Jake's team included Crystal Song of Dawn and 2 other students, a Zenthari female named Stone Beneath Stars, and a Lumina called Bright Echo of Thunder. They climbed into the ventilation system with their improvised explosives and began crawling toward the computer core. The ducts were barely wide enough for the Xanthari student, and the metal groaned under their weight. Jake could hear the sounds of battle beginning below as Dr. Kethavar's team engaged the Devourers. Plasma fire lit up the corridors, and the mechanical voices of the machines rose in response. First position, Jake whispered as they reached a grate overlooking the main power column. Below them, 5 Devourer units stood guard around the massive energy conduit that fed power to their drain operation. Jake placed his largest explosive device against the structural supports above them and set the timer. They moved to the second position, a junction where 3 major support beams met. The battle below was getting more intense. Jake could see Dr. Kethavar fighting 3 Devourers at once, his plasma sword leaving trails of light in the air. The Xanthari professor moved like a dancer, but Jake could tell he was getting tired. Second, device placed, Crystal reported. Jake, the Devourers are adapting to our tactics faster than expected. They are learning from each encounter. Then we better make sure this is the last encounter, Jake replied. The third position was directly above the Devourer's main control unit, a large machine that was coordinating the entire operation. Jake could see data streams flowing between it and the smaller units like a brain controlling multiple bodies. If they could destroy it, the other machines might become confused and easier to fight. Jake was setting the final explosive when something went wrong. The grate below him gave way with a screech of tearing metal. He fell 10 feet and landed hard on the computer core floor, right in the middle of enemy territory. The nearest Devourer turned toward him immediately, its weapons charging. Jake rolled to the side as energy beams scorched the floor where he had been. Around him, the battle was raging as his friends fought desperately against overwhelming odds. "Jake!" Crystal Song of Dawn called from above. "The explosives!" Jake looked at the detonator in his hand. All 3 devices were set and ready, but if he triggered them now, he would be caught in the blast. He would die along with the Devourers. But if he didn't trigger them, everyone would die anyway when the machines finished draining the power core. The choice was simple, really. 1 life to save 53 lives, 1 life to save the Academy, 1 life to save the galaxy from a threat it wasn't prepared to face. Jake had always wondered if he would be brave when the moment came. Now he knew. He pressed the detonator. The explosions came in sequence, bringing down chunks of ceiling and walls throughout the computer core. The main control unit disappeared under tons of falling debris. Power conduits sparked and failed as structural supports collapsed. The organized Devourer defense turned into chaos as machines were crushed or damaged by the falling wreckage. But Jake was still alive. At the last second, Dr. Kethavar had tackled him and pulled him behind one of the massive power columns. The Xanthari professor's armor was cracked and smoking, but he was grinning with fierce joy. "Not today, human," Dr. Kethavar said. "Heroes, do not die on my watch." The surviving Devourers were confused and disorganized without their control unit. The Academy's defenders pressed their advantage, using the rubble as cover and the machine's confusion to finally turn the tide of battle. One by one, the remaining Devourers fell silent. When the fighting ended, the computer core was a mess of twisted metal and sparking electronics. But the power drain had stopped, and the Academy systems were coming back online. Emergency communications crackled to life as rescue ships from a dozen worlds responded to distress signals. Jake sat against a damaged wall, exhausted but alive. Around him, alien students who had learned to fight like humans celebrated their impossible victory. They had saved themselves, their school, and potentially their entire civilization by learning something that humans had always known. Sometimes survival requires more than intelligence or technology or good intentions. Sometimes it requires the willingness to do whatever it takes. Crystal Song of Dawn approached Jake, his crystal body dim with fatigue but glowing with something that might have been pride. "Jake," Crystal said, "I need to ask you something. When you pressed that detonator, you thought you were going to die. Why did you do it?" Jake looked around at the faces of beings who had ignored him just days earlier, but now looked at him with respect and friendship. Students from a dozen different worlds who had learned that their differences made them stronger, not weaker. "Because that's what humans do," Jake said simply. We fight for people who matter to us, even if they didn't always think we mattered to them. 6 months later, Jake stood in the same auditorium where the survivors had made their last stand. But now it was filled with representatives from every major species in the galaxy. They had come to hear about the new military academy being built in the ruins of Meridian Station, a place where young beings from peaceful worlds could learn the hard lessons that Jake and his classmates had learned the day bodies started dropping. Jake had been offered the position of head instructor, but he had turned it down. Instead, he was returning to Earth to study something the galaxy needed even more than warriors: diplomacy and peace building, because any species could learn to fight when they had to. The real challenge was learning how to build a peace that could survive when the next threat came. As Jake boarded the transport ship that would take him home, Dr. Kethvar approached him one last time. "Human," the Zenthari professor said, "you have given the galaxy a great gift. You have reminded us that strength without wisdom is destruction, but wisdom without strength is helplessness. We will not forget." Jake looked back at the academy one last time, then at the